Hello and welcome back guys to this video, and now we'd like to dive a little bit more into DAX calculations but into time intelligence. So what is that? Time intelligence are all the functionalities and formulas in DAX which are related to all kinds of slicing and dicing your data relevant to time questions you have. So for instance, you're not only interested in sales for a specific period, but you're also interested in the sales from the prior period. And you would like to maybe calculate the difference. So let's think about what are the sales this year compared to the sales last year. This would be a question which can be answered with time intelligence. Or what are the sales up to a specific point in this year? So think about something like cumulative sales, or when you might also call them running total sales up to a specific period. Could also be interesting. So all these questions related to time can be answered using time intelligence in Power BI. So let's actually explore this. I create a new page here, and then I like to have this table just to show you exactly what happens when we create those time intelligence functions and how they work. You can also use different kinds of visuals, of course, and apply them, but I think with a table it's best to see it. So let me actually first select the table, and then I'd like to go with my date dimension. I can select this, and by default I get this hierarchy in here. So if I make this maybe a little bit bigger here, then I see my year, my quarter, my month, and my day. Now I personally first like to make this a little bigger under the values, so you can see this hopefully better on your screens if you have smaller screens. So let me actually take this 115 maybe, and I think this is enough from the size. Then also I'd like to see this on a monthly level. So what I can do is I can simply go back to my field list here, and you currently see here we have this hierarchy. But remember, all the fields which we drag into the values area here, we also have this cross symbol here, which allow us to simply remove them. So we could also only display certain fields from the hierarchy. I can untick the day, and then I'm on a monthly level here. And I can also untick actually the quarter, because I don't need to show it, and now I'm on a yearly month level. So I can see my year as well as my month in here. And now if I use one of my measures, let's actually use the total sales number, tick on it, we can see that now we see the total sales figures for each month-year combination. And at the bottom, the total number of 25.6 million. So far so good. The filtering works, everything is fine. Now what if you like to know what are actually the sales for, and 2019 actually is the start of the data, so we can't look up sales for 2018 in January, that's clear, because we do not have the data in the dataset. But what we could look up is actually the sales here in January 2020, because the sales here were 944,000. So what if we like to compare this number with this number here? The sales in the same period than the last year, which is January 2019. So in order to calculate the difference, just in case we want to do that, what we need is we need to have this number here, the 1.024 million, next to, in this case, January 2020, next to this one. So we need to create a measure which gives us here, as a new entry, the 1.024 million. So how can we do that? Well, we need to use functions in Power BI, which are actually two things. The first thing I like to introduce here is a so-called calculate function, and the second one is the time intelligence function that we're going to use, which is the so-called same period last year function. So let's actually explore this. So if I right click on measure here, I can go to new measure, and to create my measure I could say I'd like to have here a measure which is so-called my, let's call this total sales, and then simply a ly for last year. And now say is equal to, and now I want to use my calculate function. So why is that? At first, let me tell you something about the calculate function. The calculate function itself is the most powerful function you have in DAX. So in Power BI itself here. Calculate allows you, here evaluates an expression in a context modified by filters. So that means that we can use calculate to change the filter context in Power BI. So what is the filter context? The filter context is the context you have in your visuals. So for instance, for each row in this table, which you see here, right, we have a filter context which is contains the year as well as the month. And only because we have this filter context, we get exactly the specific number, in this case here for September 2019, for instance, this almost 994,000 euros, or dollars, sorry. So because we have a filter context. So otherwise, of course, Power BI would return for each row 25.6 million. but it is actually calculating, in this case, the total sales correctly, because it filters the data based on what we have in each row here, right? And this will also be true, for instance, remember the bar charts we had for the date drill down. So we also got the correct numbers for each year, because our filter context in a bar chart would be simply the specific year which we had. And in the table here, it's simply each row in this data set. So 2019 September, right? 2019 October, and so on. So this is always our filter context. So each visualization you use, no matter if it's a bar chart, if it's a pie chart, if it's a donut chart, whatever you use, if it's a map or if it's a table, all these visuals have a filter context. And this filter context simply ensures that for each entry, we got exactly the right slicing and dicing and the right number at the end. Now here, because we want to calculate something differently, we want to have the sales, but for instance for January 2020, we'd like to have the sales for the prior year. That means that we need to change this filter context, because otherwise we would get exactly the same number. But we don't want to have this 944,000. What we like to have is the total sales for 2019 in January, right? So we need to change this context. So from 2020 January to 2019 January. And this is where you use calculate. So whenever you want to change the filter context, you use the calculate function. Okay, this is something you can think about or simply write down. Changing the filter context means using calculate or calculate table, but this is only if you create tables. For all the measures here, you would refer to calculate. Changing the filter context, calculate, period. So using calculate here allows us now to evaluate an expression, and an expression is always referring to a measure. Okay, so you can simply type in a measure here, in this case let's say our total sales, because this is what we want to evaluate, calculate, and now we can give it a new filter context. And this is exactly this modified by filters. So instead of using the default filter context, which in our case here, for instance, is January 2020, we would like to modify this. And one option to modify it is using time intelligence functionalities. And there is one which is so-called, as the name implies, the same period last year function. You can tick this and you see what this does. It returns a set of dates in the current selection from the previous year. So that means this allows us to basically jump back 1 year and then return the data. In this case, the total sales, the expression we give it here. So all we do here in the same period last year is referring to our dates table and there the date dimension. That is why this dimension here will always, or most often actually, be the relevant dimension in your time intelligence functionalities and calculations. So when you use or referring to the dates table, you're referring to this date column here, okay, which is actually exactly the one with unique values. So from the 1st of January 2019, to the last day in 2021. So I select this here, and then I can close the parenthesis here to close the same period last year function, and then I can also close the calculate function because there's also a parenthesis in here, right? And that's actually the formula. So what we want to do is we want to have the total sales, but not in the current filter context, for instance January 2020, but in a new modified context. This context is modified by using the calculate function, and the modifier is actually the second part here, which is the same period last year function. So this function allows us then to return the total sales number, but not for January 2020, but here next to it for January 2019. And that's it. So I press enter, and then we calculate this total sales last year. We have it here. Of course, I can also directly go to the dollar symbol to format this correctly, because it's a numerical field and it's in this case a currency. And then if we tick our visualization, just to also edit here, we can either now drag and drop it inside like that, or we can simply tick it. That would also work. Let me just tick it here. Then you can see that we got the numbers in here as well. And you can see a lot of spaces for our first year, simply because, remember, our data which we imported starts in January 2019, so there is no date for January 2018. That's clear. And the same is true for all the other dates in the first year of our dataset. However, for January 2020, as you can see here, what do we have? Our total sales last year here returns 1.024 million. Now, if we have a closer look at the January 2019 sales, this is exactly this number. And the same is true for the other ones. So for instance, for February, this 989,000, almost 990,000, is exactly the number which appears here. So this total sales last year, so using the calculate function to modify this filter context here into a new filter context, which is simply a date shifted 1 year back, returns exactly the number which we see here. And the same is true then for March, which you can see here, and so on. So this is true for the rest of the data set here. You can also see it expands here also to 2021, because here we can see actually the number of 2020, which is this one here. So that works. That's how this total sales last year exactly works. And now, of course, if you like to calculate the difference, right, all you need to do is, we already know this, so you can subtract measures from each other. So as soon as you have built this total sales last year, you can simply right click on here, new measure, and say difference last year, or whatever you want to call it. So if you select this one here, then you can simply just wait until this window opens. And here we go. And then I call it simply difference last year or prior year, whatever you want to name it, and then equals, and then you simply refer to the total sales, and simply subtract the total sales last year. So total sales last year, here we go. You can press tab, select it, press tab, press enter, and then you simply calculate the difference. And now if you go in here and then you select it as also as a measure in here and drop it inside, you can see that now you got exactly the numbers as differences. And of course, I forgot to format the data, so it's selected, and also show it as a dollar amount here. And then I can see here, of course, for these ones, simply by subtracting blank, it remains the same value. But here, for these ones here, you can see exactly it's formatted like the difference. And we can see that in January, for instance, 2020, we made less sales than in the same period in the last year. Okay? So that's how you can use those time intelligence functions. It was an introduction to that, same period last year, but the main point I'd like to give you here, or what you should use and take home with you, is for modifying the current filter context, and each visual has a filter context. So in our case, a table has always the filter context as a single row. Now, the filter context can be modified, and if you want to modify it, you need to leverage the calculate function, and this function then needs a specific expression, which is actually always referring to a measure, and this expression then can be evaluated in a new context, and this new context is the second part. And there are various time intelligence functions. We have explored only one here. We will explore other ones as well in the next couple of videos, but these allow us to modify then this context. Okay? So that's it for this video. It was a lot, I know, but please try it out. Also rewatch the video if you want, and then dive into further time intelligence functions with me together in the next video. Until then, best guys.